Amélie Nothomb understands something that a lot of novelists who are trained in the humanities tradition don't, which is that businesses are the places where a lot of people in the world live out the hopes and dreams and the drama of their lives. And businesses are not boring, flat places. Businesses are theaters for people to live out their ambitions, their frustrations, their hopes, their hates, their loves, all sorts of things. And I've always been a little bit saddened by the fact that many of my friends who work in the humanities have this idea that thinking of any activity as a business is somehow to flatten it or to cheapen it or to make it intrinsically dull, whereas the businesses I've had anything to do with are extraordinary places. They're like circuses, they're like theaters.
Welcome to Season 2 of Our Long Walk, a podcast series about South Africa's past, present and future. I'm Johan Fourie from Stellenbosch University, and as always, I'm joined by Wits University's brilliant Jonathan Schoots.
With Johan's expertise in economic history and my expertise in historical sociology, we are excited to interview world-leading academics who ask compelling questions about our country, our continent, and the ideas shaping the world around us. Today, we are joined by Paul Seabright, Professor of Economics at the Toulouse School of Economics and one of the leading thinkers of the foundation of human cooperation and trust. Paul has taught at Oxford, Cambridge, and Paris, and has directed the Institute for Advanced Studies in Toulouse for nearly a decade.
His research spans development, competition policy, the digital economy, gender, and the economics of religion, all with a common thread: how our evolutionary psychology interacts with modern institutions. He has conducted fieldwork around the world, from Ghana to Haiti to India, and his new book, The Divine Economy: How Religions Compete for Wealth, Power and People, explores how faith functions like an economic platform. He is also the author of The Company of Strangers and The War of the Sexes. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast, and I look forward to talking to you and to your listeners.
Paul, let me dive in with the question about your most recent book, The Divine Economy, which is the reason that I wanted to invite you, because it's such a fabulous book. It's the introductory chapter that really hooked me, which is a chapter on Africa. You write there that almost all economists have not thought about religions as businesses, or not until recently. And I would say, well, actually, if you travel on the continent around Africa, and you're an economist, this is the first thing that strikes you. I remember visiting Zimbabwe, and the most striking thing about driving around Zimbabwe is these billboards, or at least Harare, these billboards advertising churches. So, firstly, I guess, why is it taken so long for economists to take religion seriously? And why is it so controversial to talk about religion as an economist?
Though that's a great question, because as I say in the book, the idea that religion was an economic matter was at the heart of Adam Smith's thinking about religion. He wrote a lot about it in Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations, and he took it for granted that religious organizations were businesses, and for him that was very natural. And it was a way of thinking that went all the way back to classical times, where if you look at all of the literature on temples and so on in classical Greece and Rome, these are vigorous businesses. They're selling all kinds of services, and nobody thinks there's any incompatibility with that. But then, weirdly, religion dropped off the map of economics for nearly 200 years. It was very surprising. And the best reason I can think of for that, and I'm not a historian of ideas, so I can't be sure about this, but the best reason I can think of is the idea that the European Enlightenment favored the idea that religions were about beliefs and doctrines. Arguments that there were about whether the beliefs and doctrines were compatible with rationality helped to popularize the idea that you defined a religion by what its doctrine was. And that was something that really didn't make sense of ancient religion. And Smith himself spent a lot of time saying, look, it isn't just about the doctrine, it's about a whole bunch of activities. And it's taken 200 years for economists to say, well, yes, doctrine may matter in one way or another, but it's also a very vigorous activity. These are resource producing and resource consuming activities, as you pointed out. Going around the streets of Harare or Accra, where I've done field work, or pretty well any other city on the African continent, you become aware that they're just people doing stuff, and they're doing stuff, and they're doing it in buildings, and they're getting people, and they're employing employees, and they're providing meals and doing all sorts of stuff. And this stuff consumes energy, time, resources, money, perfectly reasonably, like a lot of other things we do. And I think the real puzzle is not why do economists want to think of this as an economic activity, but why for 200 years did they undergo this kind of forced amnesia? And I don't pretend to have an answer to that.
Yeah, one thing I found just so amazing in this work is you obviously bring this very clear economic perspective, but all throughout there's this incredible rich kind of breadth as you're grappling with religion. You're diving into kind of imagining human experience, hundreds of thousands of years ago, thinking deeply with society and interconnections, as well as these questions of resources. And so I guess one is, what do you think economics brings to the discussion about religion that's been going on for thousands of years? And is there a way that as you came to this, it made you reflect on economics in a different way, or that religion brought some kind of insights or perspectives into thinking with an economic framework?
Well, thanks for asking that, because one of the ways in which I think I've always felt of myself as a little bit at odds with the mainstream of the economics profession is that I've always thought of businesses as very fascinating things, and fascinating because every business is also lots of other things as well. There's a wonderful novel by the Belgian novelist Amélie Nothomb, which is called Stupeur et Tremblement, and describes in a lightly fictionalized form an experience she had as an intern in a big Japanese company when she was in her 20s. And Amélie Nothomb understands something that a lot of novelists who are trained in the humanities tradition don't, which is that businesses are the places where a lot of people in the world live out the hopes and dreams and the drama of their lives. And businesses are not boring, flat places. Businesses are theaters for people to live out their ambitions, their frustrations, their hopes, their hates, their loves, all sorts of things. And I've always been a little bit saddened by the fact that many of my friends who work in the humanities have this idea that thinking of any activity as a business is somehow to flatten it, or to cheapen it, or to make it intrinsically dull. Whereas the businesses I've had anything to do with are extraordinary places. They're like circuses, they're like theaters. And the stuff that happens in them is very rich. So for me, thinking of economics as a business is not to flatten it. And by the way, I've had some pushback from a number of people who say, but you think that the whole of religious motivation is just about profit seeking and so on. It isn't. I mean, most people who work in businesses are not seeking profit. They're seeking other things. I mean, they may be seeking, revenge against their father, or a way to impress their girlfriend, or all sorts of things. They're not seeking profits. The important point is that if the business doesn't make enough profit to survive, it disappears, and then they can't do that. That's why profits matter. But it's not because people are sitting there thinking about profits all the time. It's saying, before we can understand what they're doing, we have to understand how they've been able to do it in a way that is sustainable. Sustainable means making enough resources to keep the show on the road.
I want to return to the book, and actually to Ghana. I was in Ghana last week. One of the things I did while I was there was to visit one of these coffin makers. And in Ghana, they make, for the listeners who don't know, they make these fabulous coffins. You can get anything from a aeroplane to a shoe to a chili. I bought a small chili coffin as a keepsake. But it's kind of an interesting economic phenomenon as well, right? These coffins in a society with a GDP per capita of $2,500 go for about $1,000 each, which is pretty sizable. And I couldn't really understand why. Like, why would one invest, if that's the right word, in something which perishes within the first couple of months after a burial? How should economists think about this?
Well, I find it slightly sinister that you went to Ghana shopping for coffins. I hope you don't have anybody particular in mind. The fact that Ghana has, as you rightly point out, an incredibly exuberant coffin industry is a very good illustration of the economic theory of signaling. The whole point about signaling, and many economists will know that it goes back to Thorstein Veblen, who talked about the idea of wasteful expenditure as a signal of the ability to afford it. The idea is that you can afford to spend money on something that is precisely pointless. Its pointlessness is the point, if I could put it that way. There is something in your face about saying, we can afford to spend a lot of money on a beautiful object which will go underground and rot because we care about this, and we care about this, and we don't have to make it utilitarian. But it's not just Ghana. If you go back to some of the very first burials 40 to 50,000 years ago in prehistoric Europe or in other parts of the world, you will see people left grave goods in the graves. And we tell ourselves now, well, yes, it was all because they thought that these goods would accompany people into the afterlife and maybe they would be useful there. But I'm not so sure that we have to have a story like that. I think we can say, if you are accompanying somebody who's very dear to you, then making a gesture of something which perishes with them is actually one of the finest and noblest things you can do. I mean, I was at a funeral of a former PhD student of mine, actually. It was a very sad occasion, who died in a terrible accident along with several members of her family. And the place was strewn with flowers. And I was thinking exactly as I was looking at it that, of course, we put flowers in there because, yes, we're not going to see them again, but that in a way links us to the person whom we're not going to see again either. So I think that the pointlessness of the gesture is its beauty and its symbolism, and that it happens in Ghana to have taken a particular form. And so now, if you lose a person who's dear to you in Ghana, it's very important that you spend a lot of money on buying a coffin that is exuberant, and it's the very fact that it disappears that shows how much you care for the person. So it's not that much of a puzzle to me. And it's important to keep in mind the paradox that you can simultaneously want to spend that money when the person who's dear to you is departed, but at the same time find the thought that you might have to spend that money absolutely terrifying. And when I and my colleagues went and offered insurance to people against future funeral expenditure, it's clear that they found that very valuable because they don't like the thought of having to do it, even if faced with the decease of the person that is close to them, they don't hesitate for a second.
I want to stay on that point of the insurance. I mean, this refers to a QJE paper that you published in 2020, where you offered this funeral insurance, but the interesting thing was that then this religious donations declined as a result. So what does that tell us about the kind of economic role of churches in Africa? Are they not merely serving our spiritual needs, but they're also providing some form of financial assistance or support, basically as these pseudo banks?
Absolutely. Now, that's not just true in Africa. Indeed, an important claim in the book is that this is true throughout the world. But it's a very big part of the story for why religion is flourishing in Africa. In more academic work that my colleagues and I are doing about this, we're trying to develop a formal analytical way of modeling the idea that the churches function as platforms offering a bundle of goods which are strictly religious in form. That's to say, they're based around ritual, and they're based around ceremony, and they're based around prayer, and they're based around moral teaching. They're based around providing people with a narrative of their lives and the place of their lives in the universe. But at the same time, they offer a whole lot of what we call network benefits. And the network benefits include some very specific things like insurance, but they also include things like putting people in touch who might be able to get married, or people who might be able to have business relationships. And that's particularly important in a continent where urbanization is proceeding fast. It's worth remembering that the density of population in cities in Africa is much greater than it has been historically in many other parts of the world, denser even than it was in most European cities during the period of urbanization in the 18th and 19th centuries. So the populations are very densely packed, but they don't actually know each other. Many of them have come in from the countryside. They find themselves living in very densely packed slums with people whom they hardly know. And what the churches provide is a set of networks which enables them to navigate that very challenging environment. Navigate it both in the sense of figuring out who in that environment they can trust, but also navigate it in the sense of having a range of services which the state does not provide, services which include things like financial help when they need it, which includes things like support when they lose their jobs or if they're trying to find jobs. It includes support when they're sick, a whole series of things like that, which if you were in some kind of Scandinavian style welfare state, you might be able to go to the formal institutions of the state to provide for you, but which in most parts of Africa you can't.
Yeah. You open the book with this amazing story. Again, I think he shows this way that you really kind of link imagining human experience into this bigger picture, just as you say now, the networks, the possibilities afforded. But you tell the story of Grace, who is working 12-hour days, selling water on the street, living at the poverty line, and still gives 10 to 12% of her money to the church, to this incredibly wealthy pastor who clearly doesn't need it. And you use that as a way to explore what's going on here. And some of these things that you just mentioned now, all of the kind of possibilities belonging to a shared religious community offers. But there was something that you said there that really struck my interest, which was you say, she can participate in this community, making a donation that's big enough to hurt. It really struck me because, it made me suddenly think we might just think of, say, church donations only as accumulating for the church, for the community, for the pastor, whoever's getting that money. But I read this as a kind of signaling of 10% doesn't matter where you are on the pay scale. What matters is it hurts in a certain way. It's a financial commitment. I just thought that was a really powerful insight. It changes the question of money from pure resources to some kind of shared social commitment. What do you think about this social dynamics of more than just the cost, the obligation, the investment that people are making in these communities?
Yes, one of the ways of thinking of this is something that Jeff Brennan and Philip Pettit call the economy of esteem, which is the idea that in a lot of societies, physical resources may be much less scarce than esteem. And indeed, in some sense, the richer the societies get, the more the really scarce resources is esteem. I was actually thinking about this in a rather amusing way because my 1-year-old grandson has been coming to stay with me and with the family. And last week, he's not actually here today, otherwise we wouldn't be able to record the podcast. But last week, there must have been 10 adults around him, and he was completely determined to hog the attention of everybody. And part of the way he does it is actually by sharing resources. So when you give him food, he then hands it around to everybody. And it occurred to me that there's a paradox here because he's incredibly generous with his resources. You give him something, he shares it. But he's incredibly egocentric about attention. And what that tells you is that you can't easily define selfishness versus altruism until you've figured out what's the space in which you're defining it. So in a space of resources, somebody can be very generous, as he is. In the space of attention, they can be very, very much trying to take it all for themselves. And what I think Brennan and Pettit reminded us is that in a lot of societies, the scarce resource is esteem. Now, it's not quite the same as attention because you can be reassured of the esteem of others, but quietly. You don't have to be constantly hogging the limelight. Indeed, a successful economy of esteem is one which allows people to feel secure in the esteem of others without constantly having to be reminded of it by being given attention. But if people don't get esteem, it really hurts them. And some great evidence on this is provided by work by my colleague John Stieglitz and others in the forager economy of the Bolivian Amazon. I cite this in the book, where they looked at a number of correlates of mental health difficulties. The most obvious correlate is physical health problems. So if you're physically sick, then you're much more likely to be depressed or anxious. But it's also true that if you can't work, then even if you're getting a lot of resources from other people, if you can't contribute to the community, you're much more likely to be depressed. And this is the really interesting point. It's not the inability to consume, it's the inability to contribute. And I think that in a lot of societies, the notion that you are a valued contributor to the community is the single most important component of esteem. And that's something that these churches have figured out how to supply for their members like Grace. And a lot of secular communities, whether they're businesses or whether they're political communities, don't really make that possible. So even many political parties, for example, treat their members as sort of canvassing fodder. Their job is to try and get people out to vote, but their job is not to be valued contributors to the communities. Whereas the churches have figured out that if you can tell somebody that they're a valued contributor to the community, then actually you can make quite a lot of money out of that as well. It's a very winning formula.
Yeah, I wonder to what extent this also applies to unemployment, given that we're in a country where almost 50% of the youth are unemployed, or even more, I think. This is part of the unemployment debate that's not often considered, is that it obviously it's a form of income, but it's also incredibly important for esteem. And even, as you allude to, almost more important. You've got a paper on enchantment, which is kind of the belief in spirits and witchcraft and invisible forces. Now, again, these are topics that are, I feel, quite distant from the economists' area of expertise. But you argue actually that these, forces, or these, if we think of them as beliefs or spirits, they're not actually irrational, but they kind of adaptive to the local environment given certain uncertainties. Could you explain why, in the kind of African context, we see these kinds of beliefs persist given the growth of, say, Christianity or Islam? So why would there be still space for these enchantments, if I can put it like that?
Okay, let me first clarify something. I don't actually say anything in the book about whether particular religious beliefs are rational ones or not. And I do not hide the fact that I myself am not religious. So you can conclude from that I personally don't find the evidence for supernatural beliefs compelling. Okay. Now, that's not the same thing as saying that the beliefs are irrational. I simply don't take a stance on their rationality. What I'm interested in is what the beliefs make people do. And so, for example, I want to know if you have two rival sub-movements of a movement like Christianity, let's say Protestantism and Catholicism, or two different rival Protestant sects, why do they hold different beliefs? And under what circumstances do those beliefs incline them to simply live and let live? And under what circumstances do they then use those beliefs as a kind of pretext for fighting each other? So I don't take a view on the rationality or otherwise of the beliefs in the book, although I do take such a view in my own life. Now, why do I want to be particular about that? That's because it's possible to say that the kinds of folk beliefs that people have in many parts of the world, but also in everywhere really. There's a cemetery about 500 meters from my home here in Toulouse where people have become convinced that a particular woman who's buried in part of the cemetery can heal their afflictions. And so you go in there and you see all sorts of post-it notes asking her to sort of, cure their asthma or whatever it may be, or get them a job or whatever. Now, why does that happen? I think it's because in lots of circumstances, it's not terribly costly. And you see this in terms of health and diet and all sorts of things. The share of sicknesses for which we have clear cures, which follow a known causal pathway, is quite small. There are certain things that we can get amoebic dysentery and we take flagell for it, and the flagell cures the amoebic dysentery. But a lot of the things that afflict us do not have very simple cures like that. They may have treatments that reduce the severity, but we spend a lot of our time thinking about what can we do to live with this? And into that space, it's not surprising that people pour all of their ideas about what might or might not work. So I think I'm suggesting that the dimensionality of the evidence is not large enough to significantly constrain the dimensionality of the potential causal mechanisms we're interested in. Okay, and you can see this. Think about, for example, medication for pain. A lot of pain is very, very hard to treat. We know that pain is highly responsive to certain placebo treatments. We also know that pain is quite responsive to certain things like acupuncture, which we don't really know enough about to classify. We don't know whether acupuncture works through placebo or whether it works through some as yet not understood causal mechanism within the human physiology. And so you can try all sorts of things. If you have chronic pain, you can take analgesics, but at the same time, unless the analgesics just make it disappear, you've got all sorts of reasons to try and discuss other stuff. I think for me, it's just not surprising that the space of potential explanations for things we don't understand remains very rich and is not highly constrained by the available evidence.
Discussing this idea of invisible powers, I wanted to ask how you draw the boundaries of religion. For example, I really believe in medicine, although I don't really know how it works. I really believe in all sorts of invisible powers. I believe in protons and neutrons and quarks and gluons, or in gravity. And these beliefs kind of really structure my world. And I also believe in the priestly experts who interface with that world. They're the physicists. So I wonder, how do you draw the boundaries of religion? Does my belief in science organize my own practice in a similar way to religion? Or is there something more formal about organized religions and religious movements that makes them their own kind of category for drawing the boundaries?
Great question and quite challenging. So in the chapter on defining religion, where I say, what is religion? I say that it's a set of activities that turns around the interaction of human beings with invisible spirits who are believed to be capable of intervening in the world, who care enough about us to be susceptible to our entreaties, and whose actions make a difference to our well-being. Okay. Now, there's obviously a spectrum of possibilities in various directions of things that are a bit like religion but are not actually religion. And so one of the things I mention, only to say no more about it, is magic. And one of the things I say is, what's the difference between religion and magic? Well, we can think about the difference as being about the difference between manipulating the world and trying to persuade spirits in the world. It's the difference between technology and diplomacy. When we do a magic trick, we're trying to manipulate some kind of technology that's a bit opaque to us, and it's a matter of whether we got the steps right. But when you're trying to pray to the Virgin Mary or to Saint Bernadette of Lourdes or to the goddess Lakshmi to do something for you, you're using a social skill, which is the social skill of diplomacy, of trying to persuade. Clearly, there's going to be a sort of fuzzy boundary between those two, that sometimes you've become convinced that a particular deity is going to respond to you, but you have to follow the steps because somewhere in a text somewhere it's been written that the deity only responds because of the text. But there's a passage in the Iliad, I've forgotten where exactly, the goddess Athena, I think it is, but I'm now going senile, so I can't remember if it's Athena. People appeal to her to intervene at some point in the war. They go to her and they make sacrifices, and then she just looks at them and says, no. That's a kind of reminder, which I think was very important for Homer, that the gods remain people in some sense. They are not machines. There is no appeal to the gods that is guaranteed to work. Whereas if you were an alchemist or something, you thought that out there was an algorithm which, if you followed the steps, was guaranteed to work. And of course, because it often didn't work, that showed you hadn't followed the steps. But those are two kind of very different mentalities. There's intervening in the world with the technology, and there's making an appeal. And making an appeal is what I think of as religion, when the person to whom you make the appeal is invisible, is not as it were, a real human being. So that's kind of how I define it. But clearly, there's a lot of fuzz at the edges too as to who official Christianity, of course, thinks of itself as monotheistic. But I mean, at the funeral I was at, as it happened, the person who died was called Marie. And we were in a church where there was a big statue of the Virgin Mary, and the grieving family and friends were invited to make an appeal to the Virgin Mary. Well, okay, she's not a goddess, but at the same time, she's supposed to be listening to our prayers. And personally, I don't particularly care what you call them, but if they are invisible, if they can respond to your prayers, and if we have something to gain from trying to make entreaties to them, then that's religion. Does that answer your question?
It does. I still have things that I wonder about, but direct appeal to the spirits or appeal to the priestly class. I think that one thing you're really seeing is how, or at least for me, something I take as a sociologist is how incredibly social this is, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
It's interesting in your answer here that, as you were saying this, Durkheim makes the same distinction between religion and magic, but for Durkheim, magic is about the individual. The individual tries to seize some power through magic. It could be a god or a demon that you appeal to, but religion somehow about society.
Were you trying to get at the idea that a lot of science is quasi-religious because priestly caste of string theorists and particle physicists and so on?
Economists.
Yeah. Well, I think my own feeling is this has to be bounded, and how you've bounded religion is a very sensible way to do it. But as I was reading this, I thought this framework of understanding belief and the practices that coordinate social life through organized systems of belief is something that extends beyond. The tools you're developing here, I think, carry. And it doesn't mean that you have to bound the study, but I really think that the insight that you're developing about coordinating social interaction through belief is really interesting.
Thank you.
Paul, I'm going to try something new, and I'm going to ask you to test your own magic here, because we've created a song about your research. And actually, I've used 4 papers, and so there are 4 verses in this song. It's quite a long song, so you need to have some patience here. And I'm going to ask you to guess at the end of it which 4 papers and in which order they were played. So it's a single song, 4 verses, and let's see if you can guess the 4 papers. So Paul, let me just explain to the listeners what I did there. As they would know, this is Suno created music. So I took these 4 papers of yours, I uploaded it to ChatGPT. I asked it to write me 4 monastic verses. I asked it in the style of Thomas of Aquinas. I'm not sure exactly what that style is, but it produced some text. I played a little bit around with it just to kind of make it smooth, and then uploaded it to Suno and asked for some Gregorian chants with electric guitar and a double bass and some other instruments as well. And that's the song. So do you have any sense of what those 4 papers are?
Well, this is absolutely wonderful. This is one of the nicest compliments that anybody has ever paid me. Even if the ChatGPT did a substantial part of the work, I think of this as a costly signal that I esteem greatly. So the easy one is, "O God, in Ghana they give." That's his verse 2, which is "Gift for burial's cost," which is where my colleagues and I offered insurance for burial expenses, funeral expenses. And we noticed that to people who got that, they gave a little bit less to their church. Right. Faith became a trade. Zeal was coined for bread. I'm having a bit of trouble with that.
That's your most recent work. The 4th one is your most recent work. So it's interpreted in a theological context, but it's not actually a paper on theology.
Oh, the paper that came out 2 weeks ago. Right. I wouldn't have guessed that, but I'm delighted that my co-author, Sergei Gavrilets, will be very thrilled about this. Do I see spirits move? Why believe the dream? Their reason finds it not. Is this the one about the origins of enchantment?
100% correct. Yes.
Zeal was coined for golly.
It's a tough one. It's a 2016 paper. It's Religion and Entrepreneurship, a match made in heaven.
Okay. Right, absolutely. I'll tell you a funny story that I'm currently working on a completely different topic with Guido Friebel at the University of Frankfurt, where we have a book which is going to be called Leaders Who Lose It, What Can We Do? And it's about the evidence we're getting about the way in which dementia interferes with leaders' ability to exercise judgment. And at some point I was thinking that we should try and distinguish between judgment, which is very difficult to monitor, and skill, which is quite easy to monitor. And I was thinking, I remember reading a paper about this quite a few years ago. I wonder where it was. So I Googled it, and this paper exists. And the weird thing is it's by me. I had completely forgotten it. I mean, I'm not making this up. It's 25 years old. I had completely forgotten I wrote it, and shows, I think, that I'm losing it too. But the fact that I find it difficult sometimes to remember stuff I've done is one of the side effects of being old, and B, I think, having a very low concentration threshold. So I tend to move on from one topic to another and forget what I wrote a little while ago.
So we try and read in detail when we interview a guest. And I must say, Jonathan and I both struggle to just appreciate almost the breadth of your work.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's many questions we have here on female networks, for example, in the corporate sector, and all kinds of interesting. I mean, we haven't even talked about Company of Strangers yet, but I do want to talk about this one paper on zero-sum thinking and positive-sum thinking, partly because that's also my kind of interest. So perhaps you could just explain to the listeners, what do you mean when you say there's the evolution of zero-sum and positive-sum worldviews? What is the results of this paper?
Okay, so Sergei Gavrilets, who's a biologist in the US and a sort of friend of mine for quite a few years, we have been interested in the notion of zero-sum thinking, which is, we could summarize as the conviction that people's interests in society are opposed. If there's only a fixed amount of cake to go round, if I'm to get more, that means you have to get less. So our interests are strictly divergent. And similarly, if you do well, that's bad news for me. I actually think it's very difficult to be completely zero-sum convinced because, you know, we all know that, for example, our family can do well compared to some other families. So coalitions of us can do better, and there's room for cooperation within the coalitions. But broadly speaking, you can think of zero-sum thinking as the conviction that there's only a fixed amount of resources to go around. And we see debates about this at all sorts of levels. So debates about, say, the appropriate level of immigration are often couched in terms of there being a fixed number of jobs to go around. People say, well, if there are more jobs for the immigrants, then there are fewer jobs for the native workers. In the book you kindly referred to, The Company of Strangers, one of the things I wanted to say was that it's actually the conviction that there are gains that can be shared by everybody that's one of the great foundations of human civilization. Ceasing to think of the world as a fixed pie in which some people's gains can only come at the expense of other people is actually one of the ways in which the world has made most progress in the last centuries. But what we were interested in was trying to figure out whether the belief that the world is a zero-sum place is responsive to the reality of the world. Does the reality of the world constrain people's ideas about it? And so what we wanted to think about was, can it be the case that, for example, if Vladimir Putin thinks that the only way in which Russia can become great is by destroying Ukraine, this induces him to behave in such a way that his worldview dominates. And sadly, recent events appear to be suggesting that that might be the case. Now, we wanted to come at this with a relatively theoretical perspective and say, in what circumstances would it be true that the worldview, which is the most accurate description of the actual state of the environment, would tend to spread at the expense of the other? So we took a very simple environment. We said, look, some of the time it really is a zero-sum environment. Some of the time it really is a positive-sum environment. So you could imagine the weather might make a difference. If you have, for example, a drought and there's only a fixed amount of water, and if we have more water, you have less water, then in that environment it's zero-sum. But once water becomes plentiful and you can grow lots of things, but you can only grow them if you can cooperate, then the environment becomes positive sum. And so what we wanted to do is to say, what would the conditions have to be such that if the environment is zero sum, then it makes the belief that it's zero sum more successful. That's to say, the people who hold that belief do better in that environment, and they then tend to spread and dominate. Whereas in an environment that's genuinely positive, the people who believe that become more successful. And what the paper shows is that in a relatively simple context, where the interactions between people are not too complex, then it really is true that the more likely the environment is to be positive, the more successful will be the people who believe that. Where things become complicated is when you start to get a range of interactions, either because people interact with the like-minded and they can do things with the like-minded which enable them to spread their beliefs, which they wouldn't if they had to interact with everybody else. Or if you have what are called conformity payoffs, in which people are genuinely happier and better off and more energized if they see themselves holding beliefs that everybody else holds. So in other words, even if it's the case that other people's beliefs are wrong, if you find yourself holding the same beliefs as them, you are actually more happy, more energized, more positive. Those two circumstances can mean that false beliefs spread. And then the final thing that we show is that it can be in the interests of somebody to mount a technology. We have in mind things like talk radio, podcast maybe. Fox News is a good example, which simultaneously act to convert people to their point of view, but also, and this is very important, create enclaves of the like-minded in which that conformity benefit is a real benefit. So in other words, people who join a very politically engaged, say, cable news network can get a lot of utility from interacting with like-minded people, from the sense that they have a community, and also, as a result, be susceptible to the messages that creates. And this is obviously linked to religion in the sense that one of the things that religions do is create communities of the like-minded. That means that then those communities become more open to, more susceptible to the messages that the communities may choose to send. One of the things I want to do in the book is to say that a lot of those messages actually are about what's good for the community. So in that church in Ghana, a lot of the messages that young Grace is hearing is about things like the importance of mutual help, looking after the sick. Lots of things are actually very good for the welfare of the individuals. But clearly, in some communities, you may have leaders who also want to signal a political message, or they want to get people out to vote, or whatever. Those things can work for a while if you have that degree of community mindedness, which creates psychological benefits from being with people who think the same way as you do.
So I thought that this was great. And, I think I'm kind of morally inclined, even in the face that the real world is zero sum, we should probably believe that it isn't or whatever. But I thought what was really interesting was two of these dimensions that you're looking at is how much people associate outside of their own bubble and that influence of leaders or of cultural media in converting us. And I really like this because, you set this model up in a way that, I don't know, it's kind of generalized enough for those kinds of features to show up all over the place, but also it feels very fit to our modern world, right? How we relate to each other socially and the media that we consume. You look at these two things, you kind of think about if you are loose versus tightly knit as a society, how much you associate with a like-minded group, and then say, okay, the impact of leaders can amplify or interacts with either loose or tightly fit. And you use this kind of example of masks during COVID. If you're in a tightly fit society, it's going to be very difficult to change until an authoritative knowledge source, a leader or a kind of authoritative media, can really convert, and that conversion can quickly tip, and everyone tips to a different position. Versus a loose society where, there's a much more innovation, creativity, possibilities for different things, but they kind of remain, it's harder to integrate those shifts. And I thought that was an interesting finding to come out of this. Do you think that there are insights for how we should treat media, our own communities, how we relate to knowledge based on this? Should we loosen up our own interactions, say, with others, or should we dial up or dial down our relation to authoritative media, or what?
Well, that's a difficult question because as far as one can tell, going back into earlier historical periods, we know that in some respects, village life, say, in the Middle Ages in Europe, seems to be very, very tight-knit because villagers knew everything that was going on. Everybody knew who was sleeping with who or trying to sleep with who or whatever. And so all sorts of things that we now like to think of as part of our private life were policed and could be punished. But I think it's wrong to suppose that therefore village life in the Middle Ages was utterly tight. Modern life is utterly loose. Two obvious counterexamples. One thing was that in most parts of Europe in the Middle Ages, you were very tightly scrutinized. Your behavior was tightly scrutinized so long as you were in the village, but you could leave the village and nobody would have any idea where you were. And this was even true of women. Sheila Ogilvy's work reminded me that a lot of women in the late Middle Ages and early modern period spent much more time in the towns than their menfolk did, because the men were working in the fields and the women were actually doing most of the local trade. So women were taking the produce to market. They were often more financially literate than their husbands. And so a lot of women were actually traveling to towns. We know a lot of things about the tough life that women lived in villages where they were constantly being spied on. But I'm guessing one of the reasons they liked going to town was that it was much harder for their neighbors to spy on them. You could have a mosaic of life in medieval Europe, which had lots of tight enclaves and then lots of loose connections between the enclaves. Now, similarly, in the modern period, you say, well, okay, we can go on social media and we can have a sexual life. That a friend of mine who just got on to Grindr for the first time was telling me the choice of genders that you're allowed to be is about sort of a list of about 30 different things. And my God, I've never sort of even imagined what this could be like. And so in some sense, you think, wow, this is freedom and so on. But at the same time, as we all know, microaggressions, you can be policed for stuff that you say casually, which you didn't mean any harm for, but which colleagues or friends or students or teachers or what call you out on because you said something a little bit flippant, and it turns out there's some group somewhere that has some reason to feel insulted by this. I'm not suggesting that the insults aren't real. I'm just saying that the repercussions of the thing, you used to be able to say something that was crass or foolish or possibly hurtful, but the people who would be hurt by it never got to hear it. Whereas now it bounces around the internet in seconds, and somebody who's going to be upset by what you said is going to be, maybe there are people writing in to your podcast as we speak. And in that sense, we're in a much tighter world because the repercussions of what we say come back to haunt us much faster. So I think it's much harder than we think to characterize the overall tightness or looseness of whole societies. We can do it for particular environments within societies.
We are running out of time, but I do want to ask this, partly because we asked Nathan Nunn, a previous guest on the show, also about his work on zero-sum and positive-sum thinking. But I keep coming back to this question is, can we actually change these beliefs, right? So, and what would it require? So if we believe that we need more positive-sum thinking and perhaps the environment at the moment is constraining those beliefs, is there anything we can do? Is it a kind of narrative that needs to spread, or are there any policy implications of moving towards that positive-sum world again?
Well, that's very tough, obviously. I sometimes think that one of the saddest conclusions of all the amazing work that's being done on very early life interventions is how many great things we can do to intervene in the circumstances of very young children, which we can no longer do if we leave it till it's too late. And so, for example, if you go back to the work on attachment by John Bowlby in the 1950s, which was done on children who had been orphaned during the war and who lived lives where they had very little affection in their early years, it became clear that you could do a lot of things to try and make people's lives better. But if they hadn't had basic affection in their early years, then nothing was going to convince them in later life that actually the world could be a forgiving and a loving place. And so I think we have to be appropriately modest about what we can do about this. And many people who have become, because of early life circumstances or other things, convinced that everybody else's gain is their loss, may not be easily persuaded out of it. And certainly I don't think that sort of well-meaning sermons on the subject are necessarily going to do the trick. On the other hand, it's often true that one's own personal behavior can change things one step at a time. The other day I had a small car accident. It was completely my fault. I realized I hadn't left enough space for the car next. So I tried to pull out again and actually scraped the other car. And the person was furious. He came at me. And I was very defensive, and I suddenly had the presence of mind to think, look, everything depends on how and so I simply said, I'm so sorry, it was completely my fault. And he was so surprised, coming on expecting a fight. And when I said it was completely my fault, and I said, absolutely not, I will do everything to, and everything was fine. And in the end, but it was in that small moment that what could have been a fight between us turned into, now that's just one step at a time. And I hope that, I sometimes find with colleagues and so on, if when they come in with a grievance, if you can actually stop yourself thinking, actually, it doesn't have to be either him or me or her or me, I can stop back and think, even if I, on the face of it, don't think that I'm in the wrong, supposing I say, actually, gosh, I might be in the wrong, and say that to them and say, look, I'm really so sorry this has happened and I can't think why, and maybe it was my fault and let's look into it. Then actually there's a certain surprise effect that they expect it to be a row. And when it's not a row, they may learn a little lesson from that in the future. But I mean, that's making a tiny difference to your environment one step at a time. But on the other hand, a lot of the best sort of self-help methods are ones that work a step at a time, that you try a particular thing. If you're depressed or you're constantly telling yourself bad things about yourself, if you change your behavior one step at a time, then that can have a knock-on effect.
We have one final tradition, Paul, and that is that we ask ChatGPT to ask you a question to conclude the podcast. So I've got a question here.
Am I allowed to get ChatGPT to answer it?
Yeah.
You can, but I don't think you would want to for this. So if you were designing a religion from scratch today, using the economics of platforms, what would its killer app be?
Fantastic question. It would be the Esteem app. It would be the way of finding a thing to do for everybody, which convinces them that they're absolutely essential to the community.
Paul Seabright, thank you very much for joining us. The Divine Economy, certainly highly recommended. There will be a link on the ourlongwalk.com platform, as well as all the other platforms where you can listen to us. Thank you for joining us. Thanks, Jonathan, for being here. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks. Goodbye.
Thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Season 2 of the Our Long Walk podcast. We'd love to hear from you. What's the one idea from today's conversation that changed your outlook? Do you have a burning question you'd like to explore, or perhaps a guest you'd love to hear from? Get in touch with us by sending an email to johan@ourlongwalk.com. That's JOHAN@ourlongwalk.com.
If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. You can follow us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And we'd love your feedback. Visit us at ourlongwalk.com. Follow our LinkedIn page for updates, new episodes, and additional links.
This series is made possible by the Chair in Economics, History and Policy at Stellenbosch University. Visit leapstellenbosch.org for more information about our research unit in economic history.
Thanks to LEAP researcher Kelsey Lemon, who provided helpful background research. Thanks also to the team at Voice Note Productions for helping to make this podcast. Our producer is Fasti Karlitz. Sound design and editing is done by André Burnett. Nkosi Johan.
Dankie, Jonathan. Join us next time for another episode of Our Long Walk.
See you then.
Cheers.